Welcome everybody to another episode of IGN Unfiltered, the monthly interview series we do here where we sit down with the best, brightest, most interesting, most notable names and minds in the video game industry. I am joined today by Jack Tretton. It is a pleasure, sir. You are the president and CEO of SCEA from basically the PS3 era entirely up into the launch of PS4, but you've been with Sony since 1995. You've been around in the games business a long time. Thanks for coming, Jack.
Yeah, 6 months before the launch of PlayStation 1, all through 2, 3, 4, PSP, PSP Go. Basically every console and portable that Sony's ever shipped.
That's a hell of a resume, and that's what we're here to talk about, because I got to figure you're full of good stories from the ups and downs of life at Sony. But I want to start with, how do you end up in the video game business? I mean, it's you end up this public face. You're on stage at E3. You're making presentations, but you actually go back to Activision in the 1980s. Is that correct?
That's right. I mean, I think at the end of the day, to be successful in your career, you got to enjoy what you do. I got a marketing degree from college. Went to Providence College. Graduated in 1983, and ended up in sales with Duracell Battery Company, working in Maine and New Hampshire as a territory rep. And great company, learned a lot. But it was like being in the military. I mean, you could see a 30-year roadmap to getting to the top. And when I used to come home from college, I'd play Atari 2600 with my younger brother. That was kind of our bonding experience. Nice. And I got a call from a headhunter about Activision kind of rising from the ashes of the Atari 2600 crash, looking for people. And I said, boy, the video game business seems like an opportunity to get in on the ground floor of a fledgling industry. And I didn't know I'd still be in it 30 years later, but it's worked out real well.
So let's fast forward up to joining Sony in '95. Sony was kind of an outsider in the games business at that point. There was Nintendo, there was Sega. Did you guys have the mentality back then that you were going to be a titan, a power player, or was it more of an underdog mentality back then?
Well, I think it's, for me, relevant to go back even a little farther than that.
Sure.
At Activision, there were a lot of people that really made their mark in the Atari generation, and when I was there, people were moving on and starting Acclaim, and I had the opportunity to join them. But I thought I was learning a lot at Activision, and somebody told me, make your mark, then make your move. So I really felt like I learned the industry through Activision. And then I joined JVC and started a division for them, and it was a mirror image of what Sony was trying to do. It was a large consumer electronics company, a Japanese consumer electronics company that was entering the games industry. And I felt like I learned a lot about Japanese culture and the way a large consumer electronics company would approach a division in the gaming industry. So I was competing with Sony ImageSoft at that time, and Sony ImageSoft was the software arm of Sony, and very similar business to what we were doing at JVC. And then of course Sony Computer Entertainment was formed and was approached by some people I knew through the industry. So the thing kind of came together relatively quickly in terms of what the perception of Sony was prior to the PlayStation and what it was when PlayStation was coming to play. But really everybody said, Sony's a large consumer electronics company, haven't necessarily lit the world on fire at Sony ImageSoft. What makes you think you can compete with Nintendo and Sega?
Well, not unlike this very same things Microsoft would hear a few years later. We'll get to that with Xbox. But I'm hoping, by the way, I don't suppose you had any Activision stock from back in the day that you've held on to, because you would be in pretty good shape.
I was really smart. I bought it at $5 and I sold it at 50 cents before it became worthless. So I think if I'd held on to that stock, it got diluted a little bit. But I know anybody that held on to it made real good money. And if I'd stayed at Activision, and Bobby's a good friend of mine to this day, the people that were there in the post-Bobby Kotick era made a lot of money.
Yeah, you're like William Shatner with the Priceline stock. Remember, you ever hear that story? He ended up, that stock's worth like $1,000, but he sold it when it was worth nothing.
Well, ironically, I've never been motivated by money in this industry, which is probably why I worked for some of the companies I did. But it was always about experience and it was about having fun.
Absolutely. So you mentioned sort of the consumer electronics, and we sort of touching on Sony trying to break in. I just wanted to ask you real quick, I'm not sure if you'll have anything on this, but recently there was a prototype unearthed for the never-released CD-ROM drive that Sony was going to partner with Nintendo on. Did you ever see it? Were you ever sort of familiar with this? I think it was before your time a little bit.
Well, ironically,
Sony,
I think I have one of the more informed perspectives on that because I was the general manager of JVC Musical Industries, and we were making CD drives for the Sega Genesis, the Sega CD.
Yeah.
So JVC actually sold the Wonder Mega, which was basically a JVC branded Sega CD. So very familiar with the transition to CD-based technology. And I know the story well, that at the time Sony was going to support the CD drive for Nintendo, much like JVC was supporting the drive for Sega. Right. So I was looking at it from a competitor standpoint, but the decision to move on and create the PlayStation was absolutely before my time. Like I said, I joined 6 months before the original PlayStation launched, but that was 2 years plus in the making.
Yeah,
so
one of the ultimate butterfly effect moments in the history of the video game industry,
absolutely,
no doubt.
Absolutely.
I'm curious, what was the reaction? Kind of, I asked you about Sony, the reaction to Sony getting into things. What was the reaction at Sony in 2000? You guys were gearing up to launch PS2, but when Microsoft came out and announced, hey, we're gonna get into the console business.
I think, unless you're massively ignorant, you have to respect Microsoft's power. I mean, more money than God, very much like Sony, a heritage of success in other industries. But if Microsoft puts their mind to anything and they put enough money behind it, they're going to learn. I think the thing that was ironic about Microsoft, Sony went out and really tried to find people from the gaming industry that could help guide them along the way, especially market specific for Europe or the United States. I think they are more internal in Japan. But Microsoft really stuck to the fact that we're going to learn this, we're going to learn at grassroots, we may make some mistakes, but we're ultimately going to do it organically. And they did that, and they lost a boatload of money. And I think in the early days, Xbox, you're saying, what are those guys doing? By the time they got to Xbox 360, they'd learned some, very good lessons and were very proficient at what they were doing and really built it internally.
So in that time, you did launch the PlayStation 2 in 2000. Was that literally the best case scenario? The everything about that console? I mean, it was historically successful. Did it blow away even the wildest internal hopes and projections? Well,
the great thing about the generations, I joined Sony thinking I was going to be there for 3 years, and I ended up staying for 19. And one of the reasons I stayed for 19 is there were a lot of, rewarding moments. And with PlayStation, it was an unknown comes into the console industry on shelves that are dominated 50% by Sega and 50% by Nintendo, and you kind of squeeze your way in there and build a successful platform. With PlayStation 2, it was, historians in the industry said, you realize no platform or no company has ever been the leader 2 generations in a row. So to follow up the success of PlayStation and do it with PlayStation 2 was something that was extremely rewarding. And I think the other great thing about PlayStation 2, it was really ushering in the multimedia era where, PlayStation 2s did as much for the transition to VHS and DVD as they did for gaming. And, a lot of people had their first and only DVD player through a PlayStation 2.
Oh yeah, killer app. I mean, it was the Trojan horse. Did you hear from other executives within Sony, like the TV division, this division, that division, when the PS2 was just on this rocket trajectory?
Well, the interesting question, I remember being at a trade show from a company called Trans World Entertainment in New York, very big in the music industry. And I went into the restroom and the guy looked over at my name badge. He's like, Sony Computer Entertainment, like never heard of it. He's like, I'm with Sony Music. And I'm like, woo. But at the time, Sony Computer Entertainment was like this pirate ship off the coast of, Sony corporate. Right. And it wasn't widely known by the other divisions. It wasn't widely respected by the other divisions. But when it became half the bottom line of the corporation, a lot of people thought it might be a good thing to get to know those guys.
Did you like it that way? When you were kind of the almost the outcasts of the company?
Well, I liked it because I wasn't a Sony internal guy, so I came from the video game industry. So my chops and my pride was relative to the gaming industry. Sony was a great company and they were funding everything, but I had no experience or really interest in the consumer electronics side or other businesses. So I respected the fact that they were part of the corporation, but it wasn't why I joined Sony. I joined Sony for gaming.
Do you get when PS2 is just meteoric, are you hearing from what are you hearing from the Japan side of the company? Is it just good job, or is it what do you want to do next, Jack? We'll let you do anything. What is sort of the reaction to that kind of success from the mothership over in Japan?
Well, I mean, I think that the joke in business in general, and Sony's no exception, is what have you done for me lately? So regardless of the success, the numbers just keep growing, the expectations keep growing. But at the time, clearly through PlayStation 1 through PlayStation 3, there was Ken Kutaragi there, and he was a very vocal manager, and it was said, the joke was, if you didn't get fired by Ken, then he didn't respect you, So if he disagreed, it sometimes he'd just scream out, "You're fired!" And I think he predated Donald Trump with that. But he was a real visionary, and I think at the time, really PlayStation 1 through PlayStation 3, the direction in hardware was really dictated by Japan. It used to be, here's a box, see what you can do with this.
Right.
Go out and rally the software community, go out and build a brand around it, go out and position the hardware. PlayStation 4 was really the first generation where you go from the drawing board to say, what do consumers want? What does the development community want? Let's build a box based on this feedback. I think PlayStation 1 through PlayStation 3 is, we're going to build a machine we want to build. And, I think Steve Jobs said it before, the consumer doesn't know what they want. We tell them what they want. And I think visionaries have a way of saying that.
Do you have any good Kutaragi stories?
Oh, I have a million good Kutaragi stories. I mean, he was really an amazing man, and he was just, he was unlike anybody else in that you can just take all corporate decorum and throw it out the window. I mean, he was a real visionary, and I never worked for Steve Jobs. I certainly saw him speak. I never met him, but I think he was kind of a Japanese Steve Jobs in that he had a vision that was very contrary to the corporate vision, and I think there was a time when, he was potentially CEO of the corporation. I think he would have really shaken things up there, but unfortunately that personality is not typically the type of personality that gets to run a large corporation like Sony in Japan.
So you mentioned the DVD functionality was huge for the PlayStation 2 at the time, but was there any one game that you look back on at being critical to the PlayStation 2?
PlayStation 2, not so much, because quite frankly, it launched with a pretty thin first-party library, so it was really dependent on the third-party community, and the third-party community did a great job of having great games available for it. I think PlayStation 1, it was distribution deals, but we really had games that first-party distributed, like Ridge Racer or Toshinden, that I think really showed off the technology well. But PlayStation 2, it was completely the third-party community and the leap that, let's say, a Madden could make from PlayStation 1 to PlayStation 2, and franchises that you grew to know and love on PlayStation 1 and to see what they could do on PlayStation 2 is what really drove initial sales.
Because for me, the killer app, such things barely exist anymore. There really aren't those single games that you have to buy the platform for. But for me, I bought a PlayStation 2 because a friend of mine brought his PS2 over with Grand Theft Auto 3.
Yeah,
and that completely changed my life. And that was at the point where the PS2 that game. It's fair to say that game really helped contribute to, because PS2 was the only place you could play that game.
Well, fortunate in those days, some of the greatest franchises that were born on that platform weren't born out of big checks written or hard negotiations. Just good fortune and a lot of hard work internally. The Guitar Hero, debuted on that platform, and clearly Grand Theft Auto. I think it was a combination of being a great platform, having a great install base, and having good relationships with the publishers.
How do you feel? So we're recording this. These are hopefully sort of more or less timeless interviews, but we're recording this in September of 2016. So I want to just ask you, how do you feel about The Last Guardian now that it's finally about to come out? Do you sort of have any attachment to that or stories from that over the years?
I think if you're in the press, you prepare an announcement based on what the company tells you and you go out and you swear by it.
Yeah.
And, The Last Guardian was kind of a title that people asked about all the time. And, the story changed consistently with where it was going to come out. But I had to launch a lot of titles and talk about a lot of games that were coming in the near future. And, that's just the nature of the industry. The fact that it actually did come to light, I think, is really exciting because I get involved in a lot of announcements on titles that never saw the light of day. And those were third-party titles in some instances, and talk about not having control of what ultimately happens. But even on the first-party side, things change with development teams. And I think it's great that it finally came out. I think if you live long enough, everything ships.
Are you going to play it when it comes out, just for
maybe?
For
to be honest with you, I don't spend much time on the console anymore. It's like if you worked in an ice cream shop that only served vanilla ice cream, the last thing you would ever want is to go into an ice cream shop and eat vanilla ice cream.
Fair point. So I want to move ahead a little bit to the day, like when you're named the president and CEO of SCEA, you are in charge of the brand in America. You're the face of it. What was that day like for you? Was it an expected thing? Had you been kind of moving towards that? Was it unexpected? Just or maybe I'm just romanticizing it and it's just sort of the day-to-day life, but what is that like for you when that day comes?
No, I think that was the ultimate job for me when I joined the company back in '95. I don't think that I ever expected that I would be there long enough or that I would have the opportunity to have that job. But, if you're an American and you're involved in the gaming business, at least at Sony, that's the ultimate job in my opinion. So it was a very, very proud moment for me. And the thing that was great about it is, I was very mindful of the fact that I worked for a large corporation, very mindful of the fact that we reported into Tokyo. But at least as far as SCEA was concerned, it was the senior job. And I was the CEO prior to that. And there's a big difference between CEO and COO in that ultimately the buck stops with you. And you get a lot of the credit when things go good, but you get all of the blame when things go bad.
Were there any reservations internally about the launch price of the PS3?
Yeah, the interesting thing, that period of PlayStation 2 to PlayStation 3 was the most intense period of my career, at least at Sony. Tremendous success with PlayStation 2. I think at one point, 60 plus, 70 plus % market share on a worldwide basis.
Yeah.
Just the most successful platform in history. And how do you follow that up? And I think the easy thing to do would have been to have done a PlayStation 2.5 and something that's enhanced, but kind of staying the course. PlayStation 3 was really stepping out of the box. And I think ultimately it delivered a lot of great technology.
Absolutely.
That's ultimately appreciated today. But at the time, because of the cell processor and all the proprietary technology, it was difficult to develop for, it was difficult to manufacture, it was extremely expensive to manufacture. So at the price it came out at, everybody knew that wasn't a consumer-friendly price. And amazingly, that was losing a lot of money for Sony even at that price. So it was quite possibly the most difficult launch scenario you could ever imagine, knowing that 360 was already out, that you were much more expensive than you wanted to be, that you had much less inventory than you wanted to have at launch, and that it was going to be a learning curve in terms of software development, in terms of manufacturing efficiencies. So, a lot of real challenges there at that launch. And that was about within 30 to 60 days of me being appointed CEO. So I used to say it's like it's being made the captain of the Titanic just before it hit the iceberg. It was not the ideal time to take over.
Yeah, you mentioned, because with PS4 of the way it was developed and created differently, drawn up differently. So was it a case where Japan sort of handed you this cell processor box, the sort of foreign architecture, and well, it's going to cost this much, and then you just kind of have to sell it and make the best you can with a bit of a challenging circumstance?
We always had global strategy meetings on a regular basis, and we'd get together as the worldwide management team. We certainly had opportunities for input, and certainly had opportunities to tailor the way we brought it to the market in each of the regions. But it was much more of an engineering driven, this is what the machine is going to be, and you need to figure out how to work with this. So PlayStation 3, there was certainly input on strategy, but on design, really no major input outside of Tokyo.
I have a bunch more PS3 questions for you, but I got to ask in this moment, would it be fair to say that the PS4 being made the way it was, you're referencing sort of just looking at it from a consumer, from a developer perspective from the ground up, would that have happened without those experiences from the PlayStation 3, do you think?
Probably not. Lessons learned from that whole thing, and I think every successful company learns from their challenges and their mistakes. So, you would think, why didn't you do that from the beginning? But, given the success of PlayStation 1 and 2, and given the ultimate success of PlayStation 3, you could see, and I think the entire marketplace was changing in terms of consumer feedback and consumer input being so much more important.
Let's see here. Oh, I know what do you think when you look back on that Boomerang prototype controller for the PS3?
Well, those are all real. I mean, the thing that's amazing is just, the hundreds of patents get filed on technology that may or may not happen. They may be filed during one generation, but it could be a generation or two down the road before they ultimately get applied, or technology shifts and they get abandoned. There are so many prototypes that get done. And even designing prototypes, you realize consumers, gamers are very different all around the world. So how big is the space that they're playing in? How big are their hands? And if you design a controller in one market, it may be less attractive to another market. And I think the Xbox controller had a real Western feel to it, and
especially the first one.
Yeah, the PlayStation controller had a real Japanese feel to it, and even the length of cords and all that stuff. So you do a lot of prototyping, and you ultimately modify over the course of the generation and from generation to generation. So I think it's always cool to see some of the prototypes that never saw the light of day.
Yeah, because it was shown publicly. That's why I wanted to ask you about it. Like, I'm curious if it didn't focus test well, or sort of what the reason was.
It didn't show publicly in my market at a place like E3. I don't know what event it showed at, but we didn't turn to everybody in North America and say, here it is, here's the machine, what do you think? And they went, we don't like it, and they went back and changed it. So it had already been redesigned before it had any degree of public unveiling as far as I was concerned.
So staying on the controller topic, the 6-axis controller for PS3, a lot of people probably have already forgotten that it didn't have the rumble, the force feedback initially. That was that all just out of the not a lawsuit, but sort of it was a patent agreement situation, wasn't it?
Oh, I think anybody that was involved in vibration technology, they ultimately found that there were some patent challenges there. But I think, any type of advancement in peripherals or hardware is to improve the gaming experience. And then ultimately you get to that line that says, does this enhance it? Does it detract from it? And ultimately, if it doesn't enhance it, it goes by the wayside and the gamer rejects it. The cool thing about vibration is it did add to the intensity, and it didn't take your focus away from what was going on in the game. And even that had to be tweaked and learned, because there were times when people added vibration and it didn't really help. But when there was some shocking moment, some impact, the vibration really helped with the sensory reaction to it. So a lot of changes over the course of that vibration initially being introduced, and obviously, given the patent situation, people had used vibration before.
Yeah, was it? Do you kind of? Are there any? I don't know if that went through you guys or through Japan, but was it sort of a? Do you look back and go, man, we should have just bit the bullet and, come hell or high water, gotten the rumble feedback in there from the get-go?
No, I don't think it was, and again, I wasn't in the engineering department, but I don't think it was, we could do this back in the original PlayStation. It evolved, whether it was the analog controls versus the digital controls, whether it was vibration. The controller evolved over time with technology and with reaction from gamers. It wasn't like, this is the time when we're going to add vibration. It's, the controllers kind of evolved over the years, but kept the similar form figure. The
big PSN hack and outage, was that the most challenging period of your tenure there?
Yeah, I was literally thinking about that on the way over and anticipating, what you'd want to talk about. And I think the hack and the launch of PlayStation 3 were probably the two toughest periods, over my time there. There was no winners in that scenario. It was really bad for the consumer. It was really bad for the company. So yeah, that was a really tough time.
Are you even in shock? Like, someone must come to you and say, Mr. Tretton, pulling you out of whatever meeting you're in to let you know what's going on? I mean, is it just a sort of confusion, or what's that day like?
Well, there are always problems that arise. Some of them become, a big story, and the public becomes painfully aware of it. Some stories get nipped in the bud before the problem comes to fruition. And over the course of a company's history, there's a lot of successes and a lot of failures, but that was kind of an oh my God moment. And the degree that it affected consumers was really significant. And then when you work for a large company and there's a lot at stake, there's what you want to say and what you can say. So one of the frustrating things was the inability to really respond in any great degree to the gamers, which comes off as indifference.
Right.
And I really took it upon myself, once everything was ultimately resolved, to apologize to the gamers prior to the E3 or in my E3 presentation. Yeah. And that wasn't scripted, that wasn't approved. That was just something that I personally wanted to say because I thought they were owed an apology. Obviously wasn't intentional, and is very damaging for everybody involved. But thank God the company got through it, and ultimately the gamers forgave them to a large degree.
Yeah, I think you guys, all things considered, weathered it incredibly well.
And unfortunately, you learned over time that even if you were the FBI, nobody was immune to those type of hacks. So yeah. It became more prevalent, but that was certainly a tough time.
I'm curious if you can talk about how the relationship with Japan was overall in your time there, in the sense of, we've touched on this a little bit, but kind of how much push and pull is there for you versus them, and how cooperative is it? It's because it's just a part of the game business that I think a lot of people don't understand. I don't understand it. It's you mentioned it's a big company and there's a lot of moving pieces, but ultimately with you've got the hardware, but then the software after you've launched. So what is sort of the day-to-day like back and forth with Japan?
Well, I think the fact that I lasted there for 19 years said that I was able to understand the culture and work with it. I don't know that I necessarily ever felt like I could ever be part of it. And being an American, not being able to speak the language, I realized that I would forever be an outsider. But I think to be successful, working in a regional office with a global headquartered company, and Japanese culture being rather unique, that if you don't understand it and you don't learn to work with it, you're not really going to accomplish anything. So it was a very predictable style of doing business, and that was a good thing because you knew what to expect, right. You knew how they would react, and you had to kind of strategize around that and work within that. But I think the frustration comes in if you feel a need to move quickly or deviate or change direction, that culturally that tends to be a little bit slower, at least in my personal experience. So there was a lot of education on our side, trying to explain what was going on in our marketplace and what we felt the challenges were and the opportunities were and how we'd ideally like to approach it. And then an appreciation for us to be able to understand what the corporate goals were, what the challenges were globally, and understand that while you were running one of the biggest markets, you really had to tie things together on a global basis. And I think companies that are successful globally tend to have a heritage in their home marketplace. Right. So Microsoft will forever feel like a Western company to me, and I think companies like Sony and Nintendo will forever feel like an Eastern company. And if they're successful, they adapt to those other markets. But there's no question, if you hang out in Microsoft's global headquarters and you're an American, it feels very comfortable. And if you're hanging out in Sony's corporate headquarters and you're Japanese, it feels very comfortable. If you're from another culture, it's a different style of doing business.
Any idea how many airline miles you racked up between here and Japan?
Well, I know I used to have to turn my passport over because it would get stamped so many times that I needed to get pages added to it. But, I always thought that they were productive trips, but I'd be lying to say I looked forward to them. I mean, it was
a long flight.
It was a long flight getting over there, and you'd get over there and they'd go, okay, let's go to dinner. And, you really wanted to go to bed.
Right.
And then ultimately, you'd fly home and you'd get home on the morning of the same day that you already worked. And if it was a weekday, that didn't mean that, people weren't weighing in with a lot of issues after you just went, 10 hours with no sleep.
Tell me about your first-party software strategy on the U.S. side, because I look at games like The Last of Us, Heavy Rain, and I feel like the difference between, Sony and Microsoft in the PS3 360 era was, I feel like you guys took more of a, I don't want this to sound negative toward Microsoft, but kind of a quality over quantity approach, in that not a lot of franchises and annualized things, more sort of one-off, just like PlayStation exclusives. Is that fair to say? Or can you maybe talk about the strategy
I mean,
at all?
And again, I think it goes back to the launch of the original PlayStation. People said, I get the fact that Sony is a formidable consumer electronics company and they could probably build a good box, but how are they going to compete against Nintendo and Sega that have such a software heritage? And I think there was an awareness that there needed to be good first-party software to differentiate the platform. And initially that was done by investing in distribution deals with titles like Toshinden and Ridge Racer. And ultimately, the investment was made in Worldwide Studios to the point where, Worldwide Studios dominated the employee base of the organization. You had more people in product development than you had in every other group combined. But the philosophy towards development there was, we're going to let creative people do creative projects. So my sense when Microsoft went to market, it was kind of more strategically saying, okay, these are the genres that are popular and we need to have teams making the following games. Right. Where Sony kind of said, go out and create great games. And it was a little frustrating if you were on the management and distribution side to say, great that we have 2 role-playing games, but I would have really rather had, but name genre.
Yeah,
and they say, well, unfortunately, we don't have a studio that's passionate about making a platform game, and when we do, we'll make one. But it was really left to organically create games. So that's why there wasn't really a strategy. It was more games that people were passionate about making, and hopefully consumers and gamers were passionate about playing them. But I think business dictates at some point, based on the expense of building games and the fact that first-party games had so much to do with differentiating the platform, that you ultimately have to get a lot more formal with the process. And I ran development for the North American market for 4 years, and that was that transition period where we started to pull all the regions together and start to get a little bit more strategic about the development process. Ideally without missing the creative element, but more to say we have to strategically plan our projects and our budgets to meet with driving the hardware and the overall success of the platform.
So I'm running out of time with you, unfortunately, but I would be remiss. This question's for my boy Colin Moriarty. I have to ask you about the Vita. How do you feel about the Vita in hindsight?
Well, now that I don't work there anymore, I think internally it was, this is a great machine, it's just too late. The world has shifted to portable devices that aren't dedicated gaming machines. And I think PSP was incredibly successful, and I loved what it did, and I thought it brought a console-like experience and brought genres to an older gamer that typically didn't have console-like games to play on a portable platform. But Vita was a nice machine at a time when very few people felt like they needed a dedicated portable device.
Did you or anybody else at Sony see the Wii coming, Nintendo's Wii?
I certainly didn't. I think this industry wouldn't be where it is today if it wasn't for Nintendo. So everybody respects the fact that they had such a hand in building this great industry that we've all been able to work in. But from generation to generation, you never knew what you were going to get with Nintendo. You just knew that you couldn't count them out. And I think, everybody discounted the Wii initially, and it really took the world by storm. And I'd say, there are a lot more people in the surprise camp than there were in the I told you so camp. Maybe a few people at Nintendo, but the vast majority was skeptical when that came out.
So I got to ask you for sure, you did launch the PS4. It is also an historically successful console like the PS2 has been. Can you take me back to because everything has gone right. Everything has been executed so well right since that February 2013 reveal. I mean, that event just spoke to developers, spoke to gamers, got everything set on the right track. What was your goal with that reveal event? Because it did, as you mentioned, it was kind of you guys. It was more the U.S. side, the Western side, driving the ship at that point.
Yeah, I think that was the thing that was really great. That's the first time that a platform had launched, at least from Sony in North America, and that felt really good. And really felt like we had everything right. And I think the great thing about that February announcement, it got a lot of the blocking and tackling out of the place so that you could really focus on strategy and how you were going to go to market for E3. And, E3 went off swimmingly well, and then I think Microsoft's challenges and the way they position the box were well documented. But the thing that I've always believed is it's very difficult for one platform to carry a generation, and you need healthy business. You need the rising tide lifting all boats. So ultimately it's good for gamers, it's good for the industry, and quite frankly it's probably even good for Sony that Microsoft has recovered well and that both platforms are innovating. And it'll be interesting to see what Nintendo's new foray into the market does. But ultimately, if you don't deliver with a lot of choices and a lot of great innovation, gamers will find something else to do with their time.
I want to ask you about what you're up to now, but before I do that, can you give me, what are you most proud of in your 19 years at Sony? Is there sort of one thing that just right into your head right now that you really think is either defines your time there, or is something that you're just exceptionally proud of during your tenure?
Well, it comes down to people. I always felt like I had a great relationship with gamers, and I really cared about the gamer. I thought about what it would be like to pull your wallet out of your pocket and have to put down money, and it really killed me. If we came out with something that disappointed, it made me feel so good. If we came out with something that really entertained and caused people a lot of enjoyment. And then I'm really proud of the people I worked with. I felt like I had a real good hand in building a great culture there and hiring great people and helping them be successful in their career. So the people I work with and the people I served as far as the gamers were probably my most rewarding experience.
And having the PS4 as the last thing on your Sony resume is kind of a nice mic drop for your Sony career,
that's kind of the drop
right?
the mic. Like I said, I originally thought I would be there for 3 years. I was there for 19, but talking about what I'm doing now, the opportunity to work on things that I want to work on, to work with people that I want to work with, and no longer to have to universally support what a large company dictates. And there are great advantages to working in that environment, and I did it for a long, long time, but I really wanted to get to this point in my career.
Yeah, tell me what you're up to.
Yeah,
because you've got a bit more of you're casting a wider view of things these days.
Yeah, like I said, I'm probably spending less time. Well, I'm definitely spending less time with console than I ever did before. But you're mindful of the greater industry when you're working in the console business. But that really becomes the center of the universe. I've come to appreciate the mobile space much more. I've come to appreciate the PC space, and I love the indie development market. That is where these creative minds, these great business people that are creating games that never could have been done 10, 20 years ago are coming from. And because of digital publishing, you don't have to rely on a big house to ultimately give you the money and give you the opportunity to publish. And I love working with those guys. And I think early access is probably the greatest thing that ever happened to gaming, because gamers care about the technology. They want to have a voice in the game itself. And the beauty of early access is the developer gets free feedback. Right. They get revenue to help drive the development of their game to the final product. And the gamer gets an opportunity to say, I like this, I don't like this, tweak it accordingly. And the indies in particular take such advantage of the early access program. And now that Microsoft has started it, you have it on both PC and console. So that's really the sweet spot for me, is working with the indie development community and whether these guys need help raising funds. I've started a fund and funded a company called Blue Isle Games that you're probably familiar with. They just shipped Valley, did Slender, the Arrival, and they're working on another game for next year. So raised a fund to help support them. So whether it's fundraising, whether it's general management, whether it's helping them find a publishing partner to either distribute their game if they so choose to, or ultimately sell their studio if they want to be part of a bigger thing. And I've had an opportunity to work with some great studios, worked with the guys doing Ark Survival.
That game's huge. Speaking of early access, that's one of the biggest early access success stories out there.
And the amazing thing, it's done hundreds of millions of dollars and millions of units, and it's not even shipping until next year on all formats. So, the Studio Wildcard team has been great. And then I'm also working with High Voltage, who's got a well-established studio, has been around 23 years and done upwards of 100 games.
Yeah, but they got some VR stuff cooking.
Exactly, doing some great stuff on Oculus Rift, and they've got the first and most successful first-person shooter game out there. So really being able to find those relationships with people where we see, a common relationship where we can help each other, products that I get excited about where I really think I can bring something to the table. And if that means that there are 10 plates spinning, then there'll be 10 plates spinning. If it means there are 2, there'll be 2, but it'll be the projects that I choose to work on, and that's the thing that I'm most excited about, is I've been able to go out and pick my partners, and they've been able to go out and pick me. So the free agent status is kind of a cool thing.
That's a nice space to be in. So safe to say you remain very optimistic about the future of the video game business.
No question about it. I mean, I think, gaming is here to stay, and I remember when I first got into the gaming industry, people saw it as toys for boys, 12 to 17-year-olds, and I don't know why I was doing it, but I was flying through Washington, D.C., and the woman next to me asked me what I did, and I said I'm in the gaming industry, and she was obviously some bureaucrat. She looked over at me and said, well, I guess you got to do something to make a living. And, I'm so proud of the gaming industry and the gaming as an art form, and I think it's, it's interactive mainstream entertainment, and just like, most people alive today don't remember what it was like before the TV. There'll be a time when people couldn't imagine what it was like before video games, and I think, video games have had such a positive impact on people's lives.
Absolutely.
And it'll continue. It used to be, the gaming industry imitated the film industry. Now most movies are made on gaming or based on gaming franchises, not games being made based on movie franchises. So, I sold the original Ghostbusters, and
Really?
Yeah, you were waiting for the studio to give you snippets of information, and the video game was an afterthought. And now to have people come out and court you for the rights to do a movie based on the game that you did is a big reversal, and probably the biggest reversal that I've seen in my time in the industry. But gaming dictates entertainment today, where it was kind of an offshoot that was only recognized by the real core gamers. Now, I think everybody appreciates how big gaming is.
Well, Jack, this is my first time meeting you, and I love your enthusiasm and the energy and the wisdom and the knowledge that you have brought to this.
We've had a lot of great guests on the show, so it was an honor to be on.
It's been fun. Jack Tretton, the longtime CEO and president of Sony Computer Entertainment of America, and now you can find him out just sort of playing, you're just the Wizard of Oz behind the scenes now, bringing good things into the gaming world. Jack, thank you so much.
Thank you, Ryan.
And for much more from the latest, from the greatest video game minds in the business, stay tuned with us every month right here on IGN Unfiltered.